4 centuries, 2 of the greatest powers the ancient world ever produced stared at each other across the Euphrates River, and neither one could finish the other off. Rome, with its disciplined legions and its genius for administration, its roads and its ambition that seemed to have no ceiling. And Parthia, vast and strange and built on principles Rome could never quite understand, an empire that absorbed Roman invasions the way deep water absorbs a stone. It swallowed them and closed back over and kept going. That's the mystery that pulls you into this story, not just how Parthia held Rome at bay for so long, though that alone is remarkable enough to spend a lifetime on. The real mystery is why an empire that resisted every Roman general from Crassus to Trajan, an empire that humiliated Rome's legions and sent them limping back across the desert, why that empire fell not to Rome at all, but to one of its own vassal lords. A local ruler from the Persian highlands named Ardashir, a man who by all conventional measures should have had no chance of toppling a 400-year-old dynasty, and yet he did. In 224 CE, on a battlefield called Hormozdgan, the Arsacid Empire that had defined Iranian power since the 3rd century BCE effectively ceased to exist. A new order rose in its place, the Sasanians, and the world east of Rome was never quite the same again. That's where this journey ends, but we're going to take our time getting there. This is not a rapid-fire summary. We're going to move slowly through the centuries, letting the world of Parthia come into focus the way your eyes adjust in the dark. You'll start to see it clearly. The decentralized power, the nomadic roots hidden under layers of courtly refinement, the Silk Road wealth, the Roman frustration, the festering rivalries inside the Arsacid family itself. All of it matters. All of it builds toward that single moment in 224, when a vassal king decided he was done being a vassal. Ardashir didn't come from nowhere. He came from Persis, the old heartland of the Achaemenids, the region where Cyrus and Darius had once built the first great Persian Empire. He was a priest-king of a local dynasty, ruling under Parthian authority, paying tribute, playing the game. Until he stopped playing. What happened next reshaped the entire Eastern world and sent shock waves that would eventually reach Rome, Constantinople, and beyond. So settle in. Whether you're stretched out in the dark somewhere in Europe, or you've got an hour before sunrise in Australia, or you're riding a late train through North America, I want to know where you are and what time it is for you right now. Leave it in the comments. I read them. And every time I do, it genuinely amazes me that people in Berlin and Brisbane and Buenos Aires are all drifting through the same ancient world at the same moment. If these help you sleep, that's exactly what they're here for. And if you're curious enough to stay awake a little longer to find out how one of history's most durable empires finally met its end, well, that's a good reason too. The story begins long before the first clash with Rome, in the wild steppes east of the Caspian Sea, where a people called the Pani were on the move. To understand what Parthia was, you have to understand what came before it, and what came before it was Alexander. When Alexander the Great died in Babylon in 323 BCE, he left behind the largest empire the Western world had ever seen, and he left behind no clear plan for what to do with it. His generals, the men history calls the Diadochi, the successors, spent the next several decades tearing that empire apart in a series of wars that were essentially one long argument about who got to inherit Alexander's ambition. By the time the dust settled, one of his generals, Seleucus, had claimed the eastern portions of the empire, everything from Syria through Persia and out into Central Asia. The Seleucid Empire was enormous, cultured, and built on Greek administrative foundations laid over a vast Iranian and Mesopotamian world. But enormous is not the same as strong, and the further east you travelled from the Seleucid heartland, the thinner that control became. The Seleucids had a real problem with distance. Their power was concentrated in the west, in cities like Antioch and Seleucia on the Tigris. The eastern satrapies, the provinces stretching toward the steppes of Central Asia, were connected to that centre by long roads, slow messengers, and governors whose loyalty depended heavily on how often the king could remind them who was in charge. When the Seleucids were powerful, those governors stayed in line. When the dynasty began to fracture under succession disputes and wars on multiple fronts, the eastern edges started to peel away. That's the moment the Parni had been waiting for, or perhaps they didn't wait at all. Perhaps the moment simply arrived and they recognized it. The Parni were a semi-nomadic people from the steppes east of the Caspian Sea, part of a broader tribal confederacy the Greeks called the Carrhae. They were riders. They were fighters. They lived by the rhythms of the open grassland, moving with their herds, raiding when opportunity appeared, trading when it didn't. Around the middle of the 3rd century BCE, a leader named Arsacid led a Peony migration into the Seleucid province of Parthia in what is roughly northeastern Iran today. The province had been quietly drifting away from Seleucid control, and Arsacid moved into that drift like water, finding a crack in stone. He didn't conquer an empire overnight. He secured a foothold. He held it. He passed it to his successors. That was enough. Geography helped enormously. The region the Parni had seized sat between two very different worlds. To the north and east lay the great steppe, the nomadic world the Arsacids came from. To the south and west lay the settled lands of Iran, Mesopotamia, the old agricultural heartlands where cities and surplus and long-distance trade had existed for millennia. The Arsacids sat at the seam of both, and that position gave them something unusual. They could draw on steppe military traditions, the fast-moving cavalry, the hit-and-run tactics, the deep reserves of mounted warriors from tribal allies, while also absorbing the administrative habits and courtly culture of the settled Iranian world they were gradually taking over. This blend didn't happen all at once. It accumulated over generations. Early Arsacid rulers probably looked much more like steppe chieftains than imperial monarchs. Over time, as Parthia expanded west and absorbed more of the Seleucid territories, including the prized region of Media and eventually Mesopotamia itself, the Arsacids began to take on the trappings of the Iranian imperial tradition. They called themselves kings of kings. They presented themselves as heirs to the great Persian dynasties of the past. But underneath that courtly surface, the steppe roots never entirely disappeared. And in a strange way, those roots were part of what made Parthia so durable. A state built partly on tribal confederacy doesn't centralize the way Rome did. It doesn't concentrate power in one capital, one bureaucracy, one emperor whose death can destabilize everything. Instead, it distributes power outward, to noble houses, to vassal kings, to regional lords who hold their territories with considerable autonomy in exchange for loyalty and military service when called upon. That structure had weaknesses, as would become very apparent in Parthia's final centuries, but it also had a kind of resilience. You could not decapitate it with a single strike. There was no single throat to cut. By the time Parthia began pushing westward and encountering the expanding power of Rome, it had been building this distributed hybrid empire for well over a century. It was not the creation of one brilliant leader or one decisive campaign. It was a slow accumulation, a patient layering of steppe toughness over Iranian sophistication, and that combination would frustrate Rome for 400 years. So what did that distributed empire actually look like from the inside? The word that gets used most often about Parthia is decentralized, and that's accurate, but it doesn't quite capture the texture of it. Decentralized sounds like something went wrong, like power leaked out from the center and pooled in unexpected places. Parthia was different. The decentralization was the design. It wasn't a failure of central authority. It was a deliberate, or at least deeply ingrained, way of organizing a vast and varied world. At the top sat the Arsacid king, and the king was genuinely powerful, genuinely sacred in the way that Iranian royal tradition demanded. He bore the title King of Kings, an ancient formulation that the Achaemenid Persians had used before him, and the title meant something. It captured exactly the structure underneath it. The Arsacid ruler was not just a king. He was the king above other kings, the supreme lord of a hierarchy of rulers, nobles, and regional powers who each held their own authority within their own domains. Those domains were not all the same. The Parthian Empire contained several distinct categories of power below the throne. Some regions were governed directly, administered by officials who answered to the royal court, but a great deal of the empire operated through what we might loosely call vassalage, client kingdoms, semi-autonomous principalities, and the great noble houses that held hereditary power over enormous stretches of territory. The noble houses deserve particular attention because they were in many ways the skeleton of the empire. Ancient sources, both Greek and later Iranian, describe a Parthian nobility organized into great families, clans that had existed as powerful forces on the Iranian plateau long before the Arsacids arrived. Some of these houses could trace their lineages back to the Achaemenid period. They controlled land. They commanded private armies. They provided the bulk of the empire's most feared military force, the heavy cavalry known as the cataphracts, armoured men on armoured horses who could shatter an infantry formation like a wave breaking against a sandbar. And they expected to be treated as partners in rule, not subordinates. The relationship between the Arsacid king and these noble houses was reciprocal in a way that Roman imperial authority was not. A Roman emperor could, at least in theory, appoint and dismiss governors as he pleased, overriding local interest with imperial will. An Arsacid king could not so easily override the great noble families. Their loyalty had to be cultivated. It was maintained through marriages, through honours, through the granting and confirming of privileges, through the careful management of prestige. The king was the peak of a social pyramid, but the pyramid did not rest on nothing. It rested on those families, and if enough of them withdrew their support, the king could fall. We see this most clearly in the function of the Parthian court, particularly in the role of powerful noble houses in selecting and legitimizing new kings. Ancient sources suggest that bodies of great nobles, and sometimes clan leaders, had a formal role in confirming royal succession. This was not democracy, and it was not simple hereditary monarchy either. It was something in between, a consultative aristocracy, where the king reigned by acknowledged supremacy within a community of powerful men who expected their own power to be respected in return. Beyond the noble houses were the client kingdoms, and Parthia had many of them. As the Arsacid Empire expanded across the Iranian plateau into Mesopotamia and along the edges of Armenia, the Caucasus, and the Arabian frontier, it absorbed or created a ring of subordinate states. These were kingdoms that acknowledged Arsacid supremacy, paid tribute, sent forces when the great king called, and generally deferred on matters of war and foreign policy. But within their own borders they governed largely as they saw fit. They maintained their own courts, their own local religious practices, their own dynastic traditions. Some of them had been independent kingdoms before Parthia absorbed their region. Others were Arsacid princes installed as local rulers by the royal house itself. The arrangement was fluid, and the degree of real control the Arsacid centre exercised over any given client king varied enormously depending on distance, personality, and the military situation at any given moment. This flexibility was genuinely one of Parthia's great strengths. an empire that tries to impose uniform administration across thousands of miles of steppe, mountain, desert and river valley will spend enormous energy fighting local resistance at every turn. The Arsacid model largely avoided that problem. Local elites were not displaced and humiliated. They were incorporated, given a stake in the Parthian order, allowed to maintain their prestige and their power as long as the essential obligations of the relationship were met. The result was a kind of empire that could absorb shocks that would have cracked a more rigidly centralized state. Invaders from the steppe could raid the eastern borders, Roman armies could push into Mesopotamia, and the empire would flex rather than break, because so much of its actual governing capacity was distributed among local powers who continued functioning regardless of what happened at the top. But that same flexibility carried a structural price, and the price was paid most visibly in two recurring problems: succession crises and noble independence that could tip into open defiance. Because Arsacid kingship was not purely hereditary in the clean linear sense that later dynasties tried to enforce, the death of a king regularly opened a competition. Multiple princes with legitimate Arsacid blood could plausibly claim the throne, and the great noble houses could back different candidates, either out of genuine preference or out of calculated interest in which claimant was most likely to reward their support. The result was a pattern that repeated itself across Parthian history with almost weary predictability. A strong king would consolidate power, campaign successfully, keep the nobles in check through a combination of prestige, patronage, and fear. Then that king would die. Then the competition would begin. Sometimes it resolved quickly. Sometimes it produced civil wars that lasted years, with rival kings controlling different parts of the empire simultaneously, each claiming the title, each seeking noble backing. Rome, watching from the west, learned to exploit this, and the nobles watching from inside learned that the chaos of succession was also opportunity. The deeper problem was that the same noble independence that made the empire resilient in the face of external pressure also meant that ambitious regional powers always had the structural space to push back against the centre. A great family that felt insufficiently honoured, or a vassal king who felt strong enough, could simply stop cooperating, quietly at first and then more openly, testing how far the king could reach and how much force he was willing to apply. What Parthia had built was an empire that survived by distributing its power broadly enough that no single blow could bring it down. But distributing power broadly means you can never fully control where that power goes, or whose hands it eventually settles into. And somewhere in the far southeastern corner of the empire, in a region called Persis, a set of hands was waiting that none of the Arsacids had yet thought to worry about. When Roman senators and generals looked east toward Parthia, they did not see an impossible problem. They saw another theatre, another frontier to be managed, another enemy that, in theory, should respond to the same methods that had worked everywhere else. Rome's mental map of warfare had been drawn in Italy, refined in the hills of Spain, and confirmed over and over in the tightly packed landscapes of the Mediterranean world. Cities not too far apart, coastlines that could be supplied by sea, campaign seasons that unfolded within comfortable marching distance of a friendly base. Wars that were decided, more often than not, by a handful of big set-piece battles, followed by sieges, negotiations, and the steady absorption of new provinces. Against that backdrop, the legion was not just a military unit. It was a way of thinking. Dense blocks of heavy infantry, drilled to an almost mechanical precision, protected by their own fortifications, supported by roads, depots, and administrative systems that could push grain and equipment to the front with remarkable efficiency. The legion assumed certain things about how war would work, that the enemy would stand and fight, That territory would be taken by occupying cities and strong points. That control on the map would correspond more or less to the line traced by marching columns and fortified camps. Mesopotamia and the Iranian world did not agree with those assumptions. The first problem was distance, not just the sheer number of miles from Rome to the Euphrates, but the shape of those miles. Once a Roman army crossed into the Eastern theatre, it was operating at the far end of a very long and fragile chain. Supplies coming overland from Syria had to move across sparsely settled spaces where there were few existing roads in the Roman sense, fewer cities that could be easily garrisoned, and long stretches where a marching army was essentially walking through open country. In the west, Roman armies often advanced from one urban node to another, each city becoming a new anchor for supply. In Parthian territory, especially once a force moved beyond the major Mesopotamian cities, there were far fewer of those anchors. Long distances between rivers, long distances between reliable sources of grain, fodder and water. A legion could carry some provisions, could requisition some from the countryside, but beyond a certain point it was moving in a landscape that did not support large concentrations of infantry very well. Climate sharpened this problem. Mesopotamian summers could be brutal, with heat that drained men and animals alike. Campaigning in those conditions demanded careful timing and careful knowledge of water sources. An army that misjudged a march, that pushed too far between rivers or canals, could find itself not just tired but dangerously weakened, its horses worn down, its soldiers dehydrated, its ability to fight compromised before any enemy arrow was loosed. In mountainous regions further east, winter posed its own difficulties. Narrow passes, unpredictable weather, and grazing patterns that suited mobile herders far better than heavy infantry columns made year-round campaigning hazardous. The Parthians lived in that world. Romans visited it briefly and often at great cost. The open terrain of much of the Parthian Roman frontier also opened the door to a different kind of warfare than Rome preferred. Broad plains, wide river valleys, steppe and semi-desert. These were perfect environments for cavalry. And Parthia's military system, unlike Rome's, was built around horses. Parthian armies combined two elements that together made them deeply frustrating opponents for legions. The first were the horse archers, lightly armoured riders with powerful composite bows, trained from youth to shoot accurately at a gallop. They could approach, loose volleys of arrows from beyond the comfortable range of Roman javelins, and wheel away before infantry could close. If pressed too hard, they could simply ride off into the open country, drawing pursuers with them, lengthening the Roman line of march, and forcing legions to exhaust themselves chasing enemies who refused to be pinned. The second element was the cataphracts, the heavy cavalry we met earlier as the pride of the great noble houses. Men and horses both armoured in metal or scale, carrying long lances. These units were shock troops designed to hit hard when the moment was right. Against infantry already thinned by arrows, or disrupted by long marches and shifting formations, a well-timed cataphract charge could do catastrophic damage. Together, these two arms created a tactical pattern that ran directly against Roman expectations. Rome liked to fix the enemy in place, to lock them into combat where the superior discipline and staying power of the legions could tell. Parthian commanders, when they could choose the field, did the opposite. They dissolved contact. They turned the battlefield into a moving space. They tested the Roman line with arrows, probed its flanks, retreated when pressed, reappeared where they were least expected. Set-piece assumptions about a shared battlefield, a clear front, a decisive clash, often failed under those conditions. A Roman commander could win a city, win a river crossing, even inflict local defeats on Parthian forces, and still find that the enemy state remained mostly intact. because so much of Parthian power was bound up in mobile forces, noble contingents, and client kings who could fall back, regroup, and return when the Roman army withdrew. Even siege warfare, one of Rome's traditional strengths, did not guarantee lasting results. Take a fortress, and the Parthians might simply avoid it, operating around it until a new balance of power made it irrelevant. Install a client king in a captured city, and his authority might evaporate as soon as the legions marched home, and the local nobles recalculated their loyalties. All of this meant that Rome's usual formula for conquest, defeat the main enemy army, take the capital, impose a settlement, convert the region into a province, never quite clicked in the east. They could reach Parthian capitals like Ctesiphon. They could sack them. They could plant eagles on palace walls. But behind the city was still the steppe, still the plateau, still the lattice of noble estates and vassal realms that did not depend on a single urban centre to function. Parthia's survival, then, was not just the story of clever generals or heroic last stands. It was a story of geography and structure, an empire whose power was spread across distance, across horse-breeding lands, across semi-independent rulers, happened to be very well suited to resisting a power that preferred tidy frontiers and clean, decisive wars. The Romans could bleed Parthia. They could destabilize its politics. They could at moments come close to breaking it, but every step they took eastward stretched their own systems thinner, exposed the limits of legionary power in landscapes that did not obey Mediterranean logic, and reminded them that some enemies could be too far, too mobile, and too diffuse to finish. Those limits would shape every Roman-Parthian encounter that followed, from the most disastrous campaigns to the most triumphant. And the first clear demonstration of just how badly those assumptions could fail came under a man whose ambition far exceeded his understanding of the world he was marching into. His name was Marcus Licinius Crassus, and the place where those ambitions broke was a flat, windswept plain near a small town called Carrhae. Marcus Licinius Crassus was not supposed to be the man who tested Rome against Parthia. He was a creature of the Roman inner world, of auctions, debt ledgers, and burned-out properties snapped up for cheap during civil wars. The richest man in Rome. The third partner in the uneasy alliance with Pompey and Julius Caesar. A figure whose power came from gold and patronage, not from battlefield glory. And that was the problem. In a culture that still measured ultimate prestige in killed enemies and captured standards, Crassus's wealth felt incomplete. Pompey had paraded triumphs from Spain to the east. Caesar was carving out a legend in Gaul. Crassus, by comparison, looked small. To balance the scales inside the triumvirate, to secure his own place in history, he needed a conquest that sounded impressive when shouted by a herald before the Senate. Parthia, on paper, looked ideal. It was rich. It sat on trade routes that funneled eastern luxuries toward the Mediterranean. It did not yet have the long record of direct clashes with Rome that a veteran like Crassus might fear, and many in Rome, reading old reports about eastern kingdoms, still thought of the lands beyond Syria as a collection of soft, decadent monarchies waiting for a disciplined army to knock them over. The Senate never formally authorized a war of conquest, but the political atmosphere in Rome, the ambitions of the triumvirs, and Crassus's own determination combined into something that, in practice, amounted to the same thing. He took up a governorship in Syria, and almost immediately began planning something much larger than routine border defence. Crassus raised legions, levied money, and ignored omens that, according to later writers, were anything but encouraging. Stories circulated afterward of priests trying to restrain him, of sacred tablets mishandled, of sacrificial signs interpreted as warnings. Whether those tales are exact or embroidered, they reflect a sense, felt keenly after the fact, that this expedition began against the grain, pushed forward by one man's will more than by collective necessity. In 53 BCE, Crassus crossed the Euphrates. He could have advanced cautiously, hugging the river, anchoring his march on known water sources and friendly cities. Instead, seduced by promises from an Arabian ally and eager for a quick, decisive clash, he allowed himself to be drawn away from the safer route, out into open country where his maps and his instincts were less reliable. The Parthian king, Orodes II, did not meet him in person. That task fell to a nobleman named Surena. Surena was everything Crassus was not. Young, charismatic, and deeply embedded in the Parthian aristocracy, he commanded not just royal troops but his own powerful following. Sources describe him as wealthy, ostentatious, and theatrically confident. But beneath the display was something more important, a clear understanding of how to fight Romans on ground that favoured Parthia. He did not offer a set-piece battle on Roman terms. Instead, he lured Crassus farther from the Euphrates, across flat, exposed terrain near Carrhae. There, with his supply line stretched and his cavalry outnumbered, Crassus finally saw the main Parthian force drawn up before him. What he actually saw was puzzling. No dense infantry line, no siege engines, no clear weak point to attack. Just ranks of horsemen, glittering armour on some, lighter gear on others, and an unnerving quiet. Then the bows began to speak. Parthian horse archers rode in wide arcs around the Roman formations, loosing arrows from powerful composite bows that outranged Roman missiles. The legions, drilled to close and fight hand to hand, found themselves pinned in place by a storm of missiles that came from just beyond comfortable retaliation distance. Normally, skirmishing cavalry would eventually run low on ammunition. Roman commanders had learned to wait out such harassment, trusting that sooner or later the torrent of arrows would slow. Surena had prepared for that expectation. Hidden behind his line was a long train of camels loaded with spare arrows. As units of horse archers emptied their quivers, they wheeled back, resupplied, and returned to the fray. The rain never stopped. The Romans tried to advance, to break contact, to force the Parthians into closer combat. Every movement exposed flanks, opened gaps, created moments of disorder. Surena watched for those moments, and when they appeared, he unleashed his second arm. The cataphracts, armoured riders, lances couched, charged into edges of the Roman line already shaken by hours of missile fire. They did not need to break the legions outright. They only needed to punch holes, to kill officers, to turn orderly formations into overlapping pockets of panic and resistance. Crassus's son, Publius, led a contingent of Roman cavalry and allied troops in a counterattack, hoping to drive off the archers on one flank. Surena drew him out, let him believe the enemy was giving way, then enveloped his force with archers and cataphracts working together. Publius's detachment was surrounded and destroyed. His head, according to Roman accounts, was later displayed to break the morale of the parent army. As the day wore on, the sun beat down, water ran low, and the Romans, armoured and packed in tight formations, simply endured. There was nothing heroic they could do with their training. No disciplined charge that would fix this enemy in place. Every step forward met empty space. Every pause brought another wave of arrows. By nightfall, Crassus's army was shattered in spirit, if not yet completely annihilated. Attempts to negotiate, to extract at least a dignified withdrawal, fell apart amid confusion, fear, and perhaps deliberate manipulation by interpreters who served their own interests. In the chaos that followed, Crassus was killed. Many of his troops were cut down or taken prisoner as they tried to flee toward the safety of Roman-held territory. The numbers reported by ancient authors are almost certainly inflated. But the scale of the disaster is hard to overstate. Several legionary eagles were lost, sacred standards that symbolized the honor of the units that carried them. Thousands of Romans disappeared into Parthian captivity, some later resettled in distant frontier towns far from the world they had known. For Rome, Carrhae was not just a defeat, it was a revelation. The legions, instruments that had crushed Carthage, Macedon, and countless smaller powers, had been outmaneuvered and destroyed in open country, without ever forcing the enemy into the kind of confrontation they understood. The combination of endless arrow fire, mobile tactics, and timed heavy cavalry charges was something new, something unnervingly resistant to Roman habits. In the years that followed, Roman writers returned to Carrhae again and again. It became a warning story about greed and impatience, about contempt for unfamiliar enemies, about ignoring geography. But it also became a geographical marker in the Roman imagination. Somewhere out there, beyond Syria, beyond the comfortable orbit of Rome's provincial system, lay a space where Roman methods no longer guaranteed victory. Carrhae did not stop Rome from trying again. Ambitious men would continue to look east and see chances for glory. Yet from that point on, every plan, every boast, every march toward the Euphrates carried a shadow. The memory of an army lost on a flat plain, under a sky full of arrows, facing a rival empire that clearly was not just another ornament for a Roman triumph. Crassus's failure did something subtle but lasting to Roman thinking. It did not make the East untouchable, it made it complicated. The next man to test that complication was Mark Antony. Antony inherited more than legions and provinces from Julius Caesar. He also inherited an expectation. After Caesar's assassination, as the Roman world fractured into competing factions, the East became a kind of stage where a new strongman could prove he was more than just a survivor of civil war. A great Eastern victory could fund soldiers, impress the Senate, and silence rivals in one sweep. And Parthia was still there, just beyond the horizon of secure Roman control, its prestige burnished by Carrhae. Antony did not charge blindly into the desert. He tried something more deliberate. First, he shored up Rome's position in Armenia. The Armenian kingdom, highland and rugged, sat like a wedge between Rome and Syria and the Parthian plains. It was not a rich prize in the same sense as Egypt or Asia Minor, but it was invaluable as a buffer. A friendly Armenia meant Parthian armies had one more obstacle before reaching Roman territory. An unfriendly or Parthian-aligned Armenia meant hostile forces could appear suddenly in the hills above Syria or Cappadocia. Kings of Armenia understood this. They had learned to survive between larger powers by oscillating carefully, acknowledging whichever side seemed stronger at a given moment, while trying to preserve their own dynastic continuity. Antony tried to break that careful balance in Rome's favour. He marched east expecting to coordinate with Armenian support. The plan, in outline, was straightforward. Combine Roman legions with local allies, push deep into Parthian-controlled lands, and avenge Carrhae with a big theatrical victory. But Parthian politics, Armenian caution, and Antony's own logistics undermined the campaign almost from the start. He overextended his supply lines. He brought siege equipment only to see much of it destroyed or abandoned in difficult terrain. He found that Parthian horsemen could still dictate the tempo of engagements, cutting at his columns and harassing their movements. When he tried to take a fortified city as a foothold, he ran into stiff resistance and mounting losses. Winter approached. Provisions thinned. Allies were less enthusiastic when things no longer looked easy. In the end, Antony had to negotiate a withdrawal that fell far short of the triumph he had imagined. His army survived, but it did so battered and demoralized. Once again the Romans had marched far, fought hard, and failed to impose their will on the Parthian interior. Antony's failure revealed something that would shape the next century of Roman-Parthian relations. The problem was not simply one of better or worse generals, it was structural. To reach the Parthian heartlands, Roman forces had to cross long stretches of exposed or hostile territory, dependent on fragile supply chains and uncertain allies. Any army that deep inside enemy-influenced country could be harassed, delayed, cut off, and even if it took a city or two, the Parthian way of war, mobile nobles, horse archers, scattered strongpoints, made decisive occupation difficult. The Romans could win battles. Turning those battles into permanent control was another matter. The Parthians, for their part, were learning too. They did not always seek a repeat of Carrhae. Sometimes they probed Roman defences through raids. Sometimes they pressed their advantage by courting Armenian kings or other local rulers. Sometimes they took advantage of Roman civil wars to push forward, as when they briefly occupied parts of Syria during the confused years after Caesar's death. But again and again the real contest centred not on total conquest, but on influence over buffer states. Armenia was the most important of these, but not the only one. Smaller kingdoms and client dynasties in Hormozdgan, Sophene, and the Caucasus formed a patchwork of local powers whose allegiance could tilt the balance. A king who married his daughter to a Parthian prince or a Roman client could, in effect, move his realm a few steps closer to one side without changing a single borderline on a map. Diplomacy became a quiet mirror of the battlefield. Roman emperors and Parthian kings arranged marriages, granted royal titles, and hosted exiled princes from each other's spheres. A disgruntled Armenian heir might flee to Rome, receive support, and later be sent back with legions to claim his throne as a friend and ally of the Roman people. A rival claimant might escape east, where the Parthian king could back him as a useful counterweight. From the outside, these shifts can look like endless, confusing changes of names and loyalties. From the vantage point of the time, they were tools. A relatively small kingdom could preserve its own dynasty by playing Rome and Parthia against each other. Rome could protect its eastern provinces without constantly launching full-scale invasions. Parthia could expand or contract its influence with far lower risks than a direct assault on Roman territory would entail. Under Augustus, this became almost a policy. Augustus did not try to conquer Parthia. Instead, he focused on prestige and security. He negotiated for the return of the lost standards from Carrhae, a symbolic victory that Romans could celebrate as the restoration of honour without a catastrophic war. He worked to install or support rulers in Armenia who would be at least tolerably friendly to Rome. Parthia, ruled then by kings who had their own internal aristocratic politics to manage, accepted this kind of arrangement not because they were weak, but because it suited them. They could claim equal status, emphasize that Rome had not taken Parthian land by force, and continue to exercise real influence over neighbouring regions. The pattern held, with variations, into the reigns of Tiberius, Claudius, and Nero. There were still wars, of course. Legions still marched, battles were still fought, cities still changed hands. Under Nero, a particularly intense struggle unfolded over Armenia when a Parthian prince, Tiridates, took the Armenian throne. Rome saw this as an encroachment. Campaigns followed, costly and inconclusive. In the end, the compromise says more about the Roman-Parthian relationship than any individual siege. Tiridates remained king of Armenia. He was a Parthian prince, brother of the Parthian king. But he travelled west to receive his crown formally from Nero, acknowledging Roman primacy in a ceremonial sense. Armenia would be ruled by a man of Parthian blood, under a framework that satisfied Roman pride. Neither empire won in any absolute way. Both secured what mattered most to them. Rome preserved a buffer zone and a public image of supremacy. Parthia preserved real dynastic influence and avoided a devastating, sustained Roman invasion. Armenia remained a kingdom, not a province, its royal house woven into both imperial systems at once. This kind of compromise became the norm rather than the exception. Even when conflicts flared, over cities in Mesopotamia, over succession crises in client states, they tended to resolve not in annihilation, but in negotiated arrangements, hostage exchanges and dynastic deals. The result was a long-term balance. Rome could not simply roll over Parthia the way it had absorbed the Hellenistic kingdoms. Parthia could not push the Romans out of Syria and Asia Minor. Geography, logistics, and the realities of mixed local loyalties pulled both sides toward a middle ground. From Antony's misjudged march to Nero's carefully choreographed Armenian settlement, the two empires were feeling out the edges of what was possible. They would clash again, and sometimes harshly. Borders would shift back and forth along the Euphrates and beyond. But a new understanding was taking shape. The eastern frontier was not a wall to break. It was a field to manage, through force when necessary, through clients and marriages when possible, and always with the recognition that the rival on the other side was not going away. To understand why Parthia could endure all this pressure without collapsing, we have to step away from the frontier and walk inside the empire itself. For Rome, the east was often imagined as a line of rivers and fortresses, an enemy king somewhere beyond the desert, and an occasional battlefield where legions could win or lose glory. For the people who actually lived under Arsacid rule, it was something much more ordinary and much more complicated. It was farms, marketplaces, caravan roads, shrines, and tax collectors. It was an imperial web that stretched from the palm groves of Mesopotamia to the oases of Central Asia. At the heart of that web were roads and routes, not neatly paved highways like the Romans preferred, but chains of caravan tracks, rivers, and mountain passes that had been used for centuries before the Parthians and would be used for centuries after them. Along the Tigris and Euphrates, barges floated grain, textiles, and people up and down between the old Mesopotamian cities. Eastward, over the Zagros, pack animals wound through high passes toward the Iranian plateau. Beyond that, still further east and north, traders pushed on toward Margiana and Bactria, toward oases that fed into what later generations would call the Silk Road. Parthia sat in the middle of all this like a gatekeeper who understood that the real power was not in producing everything, but in letting things pass and taking a share. Silk from China almost certainly moved through Parthian-controlled lands, not as a steady stream of caravans marching from one end of Eurasia to the other, but as a relay, handed off from one group of merchants to another. Spices and precious stones filtered in from India by sea and land, then were repackaged and sent on towards Syria and the Mediterranean. In return, glassware, wine, worked metal, and Roman coins drifted eastward, changing hands again and again before disappearing into local treasuries and temple hoards. Mesopotamian cities like Seleucia on the Tigris became key nodes in this traffic. Seleucia had been founded as a Greek-style city under the Seleucids. Under Parthian rule, it remained wealthy and cosmopolitan. Later, across the river, the Parthian kings established Ctesiphon, which grew into a royal residence and administrative centre. Together these cities formed a twin hub: Greek-speaking merchants, Aramaic-speaking scribes, Iranian nobles, and foreign envoys, all moving through the same districts, bargaining in courtyards, petitioning officials, attending audiences at court. Further east, cities like Hekatompilos, Ragae, and Ecbatana, old Achaemenid and Hellenistic foundations, continued to live on as regional capitals. The Parthian court was often mobile, shifting between these places according to season, politics, or campaign needs. This mobility was not just a sign of steppe heritage. It was a way to keep contact with different parts of the realm, to make royal presence felt from Mesopotamia to the fringes of Central Asia. At court, culture reflected this geography. Parthian kings claimed Iranian royal traditions stretching back to the Achaemenids. They used old Iranian titles, promoted themselves as protectors of Iranian nobility, and adopted fire symbolism and other elements that would later be strongly associated with Zoroastrian practice. But they also comfortably used Greek on their coins, especially in the western cities, because Greek was still the prestige language of trade and diplomacy in much of the Near East. In inscriptions and on documents, we find a mixture even richer than that suggests. Greek, Parthian, and Iranian language, and Aramaic all show up, each serving different functions. Greek might appear on money and in dealings with Hellenistic communities. Aramaic, the long-standing scribal language of the Near East, was likely used for everyday administration and accounts. Parthian was tied to the aristocracy and the royal house, present in titulature, inscriptions, and oral tradition. The bureaucracy itself was not as centralized or uniform as Rome's. Instead of a tightly controlled civil service, Parthia relied heavily on local elites, city councils, temple authorities, and noble houses to collect taxes, keep order, and manage legal affairs. A town in Mesopotamia with a strong Greek citizen body might retain its polis institutions and magistrates, operating under Parthian overlordship but according to familiar customs. A tribal region in northeastern Iran might be governed through a local dynasty who owed military service and tribute. Religion followed the same pattern of layered coexistence rather than uniformity. In western regions, old Mesopotamian cults persisted. Temples dedicated to deities whose roots went back to Sumer and Babylon still received offerings, even as their rituals adapted to new languages and authorities. Greek gods, introduced during the Seleucid period, remained present in some cities, sometimes blended with local figures in ways that are hard to untangle. Across Iran and its highlands, various forms of Iranian religious practice continued. Later sources associate Parthia with Zoroastrianism, and it is likely that fire cults, reverence for Ahura Mazda, and concepts of sacred order were influential, especially among the nobility. But the precise organization of these beliefs under the Arsacids is debated. Formal priesthoods, local cults, and family shrines all seem to have coexisted. In border regions and along the trade routes, even more diversity appeared. Early forms of what would become Manichaean and other syncretic movements would later flourish in these same landscapes, and it is plausible that Parthia already fostered the mixing of ideas that made such developments possible. Jewish communities in Mesopotamian cities worshipped according to their own laws. Local mountain and river gods remained important to people whose lives depended on those landscapes. The Parthian state did not try to flatten this variety into a single imperial cult. Instead, it tended to work with existing religious institutions, recognizing temple authorities, granting them lands or privileges, and using their influence to stabilize local society. Temples could act as banks, landlords, and symbolic centers, and their cooperation made everyday governance smoother. For ordinary subjects, power was felt in layers. A farmer in the Tigris Valley might rarely think about the king in Ctesiphon, but he would know the estate manager who collected rents, the village headman who settled disputes, the local priest who blessed fields and handled oaths. A merchant in Seleucia would be keenly aware of customs officials at the city gate, of changing coinage, of which noble house currently held favour at court. A steppe nomad on the northeastern frontier might interact more with a regional noble clan than with any direct royal representative. This distributed structure made Parthia look loose from the outside. To Roman eyes, used to governors, tax farmers and standardized systems, it could seem disorganized, even fragile. Yet that looseness was part of how it endured. By allowing cities to keep their own councils, religions to keep their own rites, and local elites to keep much of their authority, the Arsacid kings reduced the need for constant, heavy-handed intervention. As long as tribute flowed and military obligations were met, many communities could continue their lives with minimal direct interference. Trade profits tied these communities together. Caravans needed safe routes, predictable tolls, and a general expectation that violence along the road would be punished. That gave both local rulers and the central court an incentive to cooperate. When Roman civil wars disrupted Mediterranean demand, Parthian local elites would have felt the shock in their own revenues. When stability returned, the wealth resumed. Over time, this combination of trade, local autonomy, and layered administration created a kind of quiet resilience. Parthia could lose a border city temporarily and still function. A noble rebellion in one region did not automatically topple the whole system. The empire expanded and contracted at its edges, but the interior networks of towns, shrines, estates, and caravan routes continued to operate. Behind the cavalry charges that Roman writers fixated on lay an imperial society that had learned to live with diversity, to profit from connection, and to tolerate a degree of shared power. That social and economic foundation explains why Parthia could absorb shock after shock from the West without simply breaking. It also explains something else. The same flexibility that kept the Arsacid realm intact for centuries would eventually give ambitious local rulers room to grow. In one of those peripheral regions, at the far edges of this trading and aristocratic world, a new dynasty was watching, learning, and waiting for its moment. Before we meet them, we need to see how Roman ambition reached its own peak along the eastern frontier, and how, even at high tide, it still struggled to turn victory into permanence. When Roman power in the east finally reached its highest point, it did not come from a careful, patient strategy. It came from emperors who decided, at least for a moment, that Rome should finish what Pompey, Crassus, and Antony had only started. To them, the frontier with Parthia was not a balance to be managed. It was an unfinished line on a map. The first of these was Trajan. By the early 2nd century, Rome was relatively stable. The Danube and Rhine frontiers were secure enough, the succession question temporarily quiet, and the treasury full. Trajan was a soldier emperor with victories in Dacia behind him and an image to uphold. He looked east and saw an opportunity. The pretext was familiar: a disputed Armenian kingship and tensions over who had the right to install client rulers. When negotiations failed, or were allowed to fail, Trajan chose force. In 114 CE, he marched east with an enormous army, not just to discipline a rival, but to redraw the map. At first, the campaign seemed to fulfill every Roman dream. Armenian resistance collapsed. Trajan annexed the kingdom outright as a Roman province. Then he pushed beyond the usual dance along the Euphrates. Crossing deep into Mesopotamia, he took city after city. Roman forces advanced down the Tigris, seized Nisibis, Edessa, and eventually even captured Ctesiphon itself, the royal centre on the opposite bank from Seleucia. For a brief moment, Rome held the heartland of Parthian power. Trajan took the title Parthicus, minted coins proclaiming new eastern provinces, and organized Mesopotamia and Assyria as if they would remain Roman forever. He is said to have reached the Persian Gulf and looked out over the waters that led to India, echoing Alexander in gesture if not in scale. But underneath the triumph, the problems were already visible. To hold Mesopotamia, Rome needed more than a victorious emperor. It needed reliable supply lines stretching from Syria across long, vulnerable corridors of land. It needed loyal local elites willing to cooperate with new administrators. It needed garrisons strong enough and close enough together to respond when things went wrong. Trajan had an expeditionary army and the authority of his own presence. He did not have an entire imperial system reorganized to support permanent occupation so far beyond the old frontier. As soon as Roman columns moved on, revolt and resistance began to simmer. Parthian power had not evaporated. It had bent under the weight of Trajan's advance, and then began to reform behind him. Local cities, faced with the choice between distant Roman governors and nearby Parthian nobles who might return, hesitated, bargained, or quietly kept their options open. Then time itself turned against Rome. Trajan fell ill. In 117, as he made his way back toward the west, he died. His successor, Hadrian, inherited not just an empire, but an overextension. Hadrian's solution was pragmatic. He gave up most of Trajan's Mesopotamian conquests, pulled the frontier back to more defensible lines, and accepted that the Euphrates would remain less a starting line for conquest and more a boundary between worlds. The high tide of Trajan's ambition receded almost as quickly as it had arrived, yet the story did not end there. Later emperors would test the eastern frontier again, hoping to repeat Trajan's dramatic victories without repeating his rapid retreat. Under Antoninus Pius, things stayed mostly quiet, but his adoptive son and co-emperor Lucius Verus would become the face attached to the next major campaign. In the 160s, with Rome suffering from war and plague, Parthian forces struck first, overrunning parts of Roman Syria and capturing cities, including the key fortress of Dura Europos. Rome responded with a counter-offensive. Marcus Aurelius remained in the west. Lucius Verus went east as the imperial figurehead for an army led in practice by skilled generals. Once again, Roman legions marched deep into Mesopotamia. Once again, they took major cities. Ctesiphon fell to them around 165. The victory was real, the prestige impressive. Lucius Verus too claimed the title Parthicus. But again the deeper pattern reasserted itself. There was looting, there was destruction, there was a symbolic assertion of dominance. What there was not, in any lasting sense, was control. The same distances, the same supply problems, the same reliance on temporary expeditionary forces meant that when those forces withdrew, Roman power thinned out rapidly. Worse, the campaign seems to have helped spread disease. The so-called Antonine Plague, which ravaged the Roman Empire for years, may have been carried back from the eastern war zones. Rome had shown it could strike, but the cost of those strikes was now measured not only in money and manpower, but in demographic shock. A generation later, Septimius Severus tried again. Severus had come to power through civil war. He needed victories and titles to legitimize his rule, particularly against rival claimants who also boasted about their military achievements. The eastern frontier offered him a familiar stage. In 195 and again in 197-198, he marched east, campaigning against both Parthian forces and rival Roman-backed claimants. Like Trajan and Lucius Verus before him, Severus managed to reach and take Ctesiphon. Roman troops sacked the city, carried off captives, and Severus too adopted Grand Eastern titles. He elevated the status of Osroene and Mesopotamia under Roman influence, reorganizing parts of the frontier. But he did not transform the entire Parthian core into a stable Roman possession. His campaigns were sharp blows, not permanent rearrangements. Once the main army turned back toward the west, local dynamics resumed. Parthian kings, nobles, and city elites regrouped. The Arsacid state, though damaged, remained in being. Over and over the same rhythm played out. Roman armies could win battles, they could capture capitals, they could install or depose client kings and distribute new titles. Yet between the Euphrates and the Zagros, between Ctesiphon and the highlands beyond, their grip loosened as soon as direct force was removed. On campaign, Roman strengths were obvious: disciplined infantry, sophisticated siegecraft, the logistical apparatus to move large forces across long distances for a few campaigning seasons. In the long term, their weaknesses became just as clear. Rome's administrative habits, tax systems, and provincial structures had grown in lands with dense Mediterranean cities, shorter distances, and easier maritime connections. East of the Euphrates, they faced a political and geographical environment that did not easily submit to those patterns. Parthia, for all its internal tensions, was still an empire built around local elites, cavalry mobility, and a deep familiarity with the land. Its aristocracy could retreat, regroup, and reassert influence even after devastating defeats. Its cities, temples, and trading networks were used to accommodating new pressures while waiting for the balance to shift back. The result was a recurring paradox. At moments of high Roman ambition, the map of the East could look transformed. New provinces coloured in, great victories proclaimed, Eastern titles added to imperial names. Yet a generation later, sometimes even a few years later, the frontier looked remarkably familiar again. The Euphrates, with a few adjustments, still marked the rough dividing line between Roman and Parthian spheres. From the outside, it could appear that Rome had come close several times to finishing Parthia. From the inside, in the caravan towns and noble estates of the Arsacid world, it may have felt more like weather. Storms blew in from the west, violent and dangerous, toppling rulers, burning palaces, disrupting trade. Then they passed, and the underlying structures, the local loyalties, the noble networks, the layered autonomy, reasserted themselves. But those storms were not meaningless. Each invasion strained Parthia's resources, unsettled its politics, and exposed the limits of Arsacid authority over its own nobles and vassals. The empire that could survive Rome's high tide was not invulnerable. It was simply resilient in a particular way. That resilience would matter when the next challenge came, not from the Mediterranean, but from within the Iranian world itself. Long before Ardashir raised his banner in Persis, the repeated shock of Roman penetration and withdrawal had already begun to widen the cracks in the Arsacid house. The Arsacid Empire had been built to absorb shocks from the outside. Cavalry could scatter, cities could submit, and kings could retreat into the Iranian plateau, waiting for the invader's strength to ebb. Against Rome, that pattern worked for centuries. Against itself, it was more dangerous. From very early on, the Arsacid dynasty faced a problem that never quite went away. Succession was rarely smooth. There was no rigid, universally enforced rule that the eldest son always inherited. Brothers, cousins, and even more distant relatives could claim descent from earlier kings and present themselves as legitimate alternatives. In a system where royal blood mattered more than precise primogeniture, that ambiguity could be exploited. Each time a strong king died, the question was not just who is next, but who can be made king. The great noble families, those whose estates stretched across whole regions, who commanded their own cavalry, who controlled key fortresses and caravan routes, played the decisive role. An Arsacid prince without their backing was a claimant. An Arsacid prince with their backing was a king. This gave the aristocracy enormous leverage. When they agreed, things could move quickly. A new king could be raised on the royal platform, receive oaths from leading houses, and send out messengers to the vassal realms. When they did not agree, the empire could split almost overnight. Sometimes this produced open rival kings. One Arsacid would hold Ctesiphon and claim the royal title. Another might set up a competing court in Media, Babylonia, or even further east. Each would mint coins, send letters, and negotiate with local powers as if he alone were legitimate. For merchants and city councils, it could mean paying taxes twice. For nobles, it meant choosing sides and hedging bets. External wars often made this worse. When Rome intervened in an Armenian dispute or backed one Arsacid candidate over another, it was not creating a new pattern, only amplifying an old one. A disgruntled prince could ride west, promise cooperation to a Roman governor in Syria, and return with foreign troops and a new claim. A rival could accuse him of being a Roman puppet and rally more traditionalist nobles in response. The king at Ctesiphon, even at the height of his power, did not rule a uniform, centralized state. He presided over a concert of powers, semi-autonomous kingdoms, temple communities with their own landed wealth, and aristocratic houses whose authority in their home territories could be older than Arsacid rule itself. The king could grant lands and titles, but he also had to bargain, cajole, and sometimes simply accept what he could not easily change. Over time, this balance tilted. Repeated invasions, ransoms, and civil wars strained royal finances. To reward supporters and secure loyalty, kings granted out more land, more tax exemptions, more privileges. Each concession made a particular house stronger in its own region, and the crown more dependent on that region's continuing goodwill. What had once been an empire stitched together by flexible alliances began to look, in some places, like clusters of quasi-independent lordships, linked to Ctesiphon more by habit and prestige than by daily obedience. In this environment, local autonomy did not just survive, it deepened. In the western marches, around Mesopotamia and Adiabene, nobles managed their own arrangements with nearby Roman governors when central power wavered. In the northeast, toward the Caspian and beyond, regional dynasts could focus on their own steppe neighbours, only loosely connected to the politics of the Tigris. And in the south, in Persis, the old heartland of Achaemenid power, local rulers gradually turned that autonomy into something more ambitious. Persis had long been ruled by its own line of vassal kings or princes, important enough to mint coins, manage local temples and patronize their own culture, but formally subordinate to the Arsacid Shah. They paid tribute, sent troops when called, and recognized Arsacid's supremacy in titles and ceremonies. At the same time, they cultivated their own legitimacy, drawing on memories of ancient Persian kings and on their role as guardians of key religious and cultural sites. As central authority in Ctesiphon became more contested, that dual identity mattered. A lord in Persis could present himself as both loyal servant of the Arsacid house and rightful ruler in his own ancestral land. When royal command suited his interests, he obeyed. When they did not, distance, mountains, and local support gave him room to delay, reinterpret, or quietly ignore them. The noble competition that had once been mostly about influence at court was now also about regional power. Great houses could withhold troops in a royal war, or supply them only on their own terms. They could shelter defeated princes, host exiled nobles, and act as kingmakers not only in Ctesiphon but in their home territories. Each civil conflict left scars. To defeat a rival, a king might call on one group of nobles against another, promising rewards or revenge. Victory settled the immediate question of who wore the diadem. It also entrenched new resentments, elevated new families, and left other regions feeling marginalized or threatened. In the short term, the dynasty survived. In the long term, its authority frayed. By the early 3rd century, the pattern was clear. The greatest threats to the Arsacid state were no longer Roman armies on the Euphrates. Those armies could strike, devastate, and withdraw, but they had never managed to stay. The more serious danger came from inside the network of loyalties that sustained the empire, from princes who saw opportunity in moments of weakness, from nobles who had learned how to extract concessions from embattled kings, from regions like Persis, where local rulers had become strong enough, confident enough, and independent enough to imagine a different order. The empire that had learned to bend under foreign pressure was now being pulled apart by the very flexibility that once kept it alive. In those widening gaps of authority and loyalty, a new kind of challenger would find space to rise. Persis was not just another province at the edge of an empire. It was a memory-made landscape. This was the country of Fars in the deep south of Iran, the stony uplands and basins that had once supplied the name and the core nobility of the Achaemenid Empire. When Greek and Roman writers said Persia, they often meant this region in particular. Centuries after Alexander, centuries after new dynasties and new capitals, the plateau of Persis still carried a sense of ancestral weight. The Arsacids understood that. They did not rule Persis directly from Ctesiphon. They ruled it through local dynasts who bore old Iranian titles and traced their prestige, at least in public inscriptions and coin legends, back to the kings of Cyrus and Darius. These local lords are sometimes called the fraterarchum in modern scholarship, sometimes simply kings or princes of Persis. Their power rested on three intertwined pillars: land, religion, and memory. The first was straightforward. They controlled estates, fortresses, and irrigation systems along the valleys and plains that cut through the southern mountains. They could raise their own cavalry and infantry, collect their own taxes, and decide which roads were safe or dangerous. The second was more subtle, but just as important. Persis was dense with cult sites and older ceremonial centres. Fire temples, sacred precincts, and hilltop sanctuaries linked local clans, priests, and communities in webs of obligation. The dynasts of Persis patronized these places. They funded repairs, offered sacrifices, and staffed priesthoods from families close to their own. Over time, they came to look less like provincial governors and more like guardians of an inherited sacred order. The third pillar was the most powerful of all, the memory of the Achaemenids. Even after the great royal palaces at Persepolis were burned and looted in the time of Alexander, their ruins did not disappear beneath the soil. They remained, looming over the surrounding countryside. Staircases carved with long files of tribute-bearers, throne halls with columns that still rose above the plain, rock-cut tombs bearing royal reliefs and trilingual inscriptions. To live in Persis was to live in sight of a vanished empire. Local rulers made that memory work for them. On their coins they put symbols and titles that evoked Achaemenid kingship. In their inscriptions they used old-style names and formulas that hinted at continuity. They could not claim to be the direct successors of Darius in any legal sense. The Arsacids sat on the imperial throne, but they could present themselves as keepers of an older, purer Persian tradition beneath the changing surface of foreign and northern rule. Religion reinforced that claim. The early form of what we call Zoroastrianism had deep roots in this region, and later Sasanian sources would insist that the sacred fires and priestly lineages of Persis had preserved true doctrine and ritual through foreign domination. How much of that is retrospective propaganda is uncertain, but there is little doubt that southern Iran housed communities whose religious prestige resonated far beyond their immediate valleys. Into this world Ardashir was born. His family were not outsiders. They were products of this southern aristocracy, tied into its temples, estates, and warrior networks. Later Sasanian tradition would make his lineage sound as illustrious as possible, tracing it back to earlier kings or sacred figures. Modern historians are cautious about those claims, but the basic picture seems clear. Ardashir grew up within a household that combined local military leadership with custodianship of religious sites. His father, Papak, appears in our sources as a local ruler in the region of Istaka, near the ruins of Persepolis. Under the Arsacid system, Papa owed allegiance to a higher-ranking dynasty of Persis, who in turn owed allegiance to the king at Ctesiphon. It was a chain of loyalties, each link formally subordinate to the next. But chains can be reversed. As Arsacid power became more contested, a man like Papa gained options. He could appeal upward to Ctesiphon against his immediate overlord. He could bargain sideways with neighbouring nobles. He could present any local move as either loyal enforcement of royal interests or necessary defence of ancestral rights. Somewhere within this shifting web, Ardashir learned how power worked. He started small, commanding a fortress, then a district. Later sources place his early career in the garrison town of Darabgerd, where he may have been entrusted with local defence and administration. Whether every detail of those stories is accurate is less important than the pattern they imply. Ardashir advanced not by suddenly appearing with a rebel army, but by climbing the rungs that already existed in the Arsacid hierarchy. Local command, regional recognition, then something more. As he rose, he moved through a landscape thick with signs that another kind of kingship had once been possible. Every ride past the terraces of Persepolis, every ceremony performed at a fire temple that claimed ancient foundation, every coin that invoked older Persian symbols, reminded ambitious men in Persis that empire did not have to look like an Arsacid noble confederation. It could look like a single, commanding king in the Iranian heartland. The weakening of the imperial centre turned those impressions into opportunities. When the king in Ctesiphon struggled to impose his will, when rival Arsacid claimants fought and bargained for support, the dynasts of Persis could choose their responses with increasing freedom. They could delay tribute, expand their local levies, fortify their strongholds, and frame all of it as temporary necessity. In practice, they were rehearsing independence. By the time Ardashir began consolidating power under his own name, Persis had become more than a loyal southern province. It was a reservoir of alternative legitimacy, an area where the language of Achaemenid memory, religious guardianship, and local kingship could be combined into something larger. A man who could master that combination, who could present himself as both traditional Persian ruler and restorer of a wider Iranian order, would not have to march on Ctesiphon as a mere rebel vassal. He could march as the representative of a different idea of empire. That is what Persis gave Ardashir. Not just troops and fortresses, but a story in which the south was not a distant corner of an Arsacid realm, but the starting point of a renewal. From those uplands and ruined palaces, the seeds of revolt were already sprouting, waiting for someone determined enough to cultivate them into a revolution. Ardashir's first decisive move was not against the Arsacid king in Ctesiphon. It was against the man who stood between him and the full resources of Persis. The higher dynast who nominally ruled the region had long been the senior partner in southern Iran. Papa, Ardashir's father, was technically his subordinate. In the older order, that hierarchy would have been stable. The great house of Persis would have balanced local families like Papa's, and both would have bowed, at least in theory, to the Arsacid king. But balance depends on everyone believing it still exists. As Arsacid authority frayed in the north, Papa and Ardashir acted. Our sources differ on the exact sequence, but the outline is consistent. Papa moved against his own overlord, deposing or killing him. In some accounts, Ardashir is the active hand in this coup, in others he emerges as the main beneficiary afterward. Either way, the result was clear. The old senior house of Persis was pushed aside. Papa's line took its place. From that moment, Ardashir's world widened. Instead of holding a fortress or a district, he now operated at the level of regional politics. He began to appear on coinage and inscriptions as a ruler in his own right. The titles were still layered with caution: king of a specific area, son of Papak, a noble within a greater structure. But within Persis, the hierarchy that once constrained him had been inverted. He had climbed the chain of vassalage until there was no one left immediately above him. Consolidation followed. Ardashir did not begin by racing north toward imperial capitals. He turned first to the land he knew best. Town by town, valley by valley, he tightened his grip on Persis. Fortresses that had once owed their loyalty to multiple patrons now owed it to him alone. Local lords were drawn into his orbit through marriage alliances, grants of land, or simple force. The process was not just military, it was administrative. Ardashir seems to have reorganized local taxation and garrison duties, ensuring that soldiers in his service were provisioned by communities directly tied to his household. In doing so, he reduced the room for independent noble action. A lord who depended on Ardashir for official recognition, who watched Ardashir's men collect revenues and move through the passes, had to think carefully before backing any rival. Underneath the formal language of loyalties, the reality was straightforward. Persis was becoming a more unified, more centralized base of power than it had been for generations. With that base secured, Ardashir began to look outward. Neighbouring districts that had once been loosely attached to Persis, or only weakly controlled by Arsacid appointees, became his next targets. The plateau and coastal lowlands to the east and west offered both opportunity and danger. Rival petty kings and local magnates watched events in Persis closely. Some hoped to profit from the reshuffling. Others feared becoming the next victims of it. Ardashir moved before they could decide. Campaigns into adjacent regions like Kerman and the fringes of Elymais are hinted at in later texts and in the scattering of early Sasanian reliefs. The pattern those traces suggest is one of probing attacks, rapid sieges of key strongholds, and political settlements that left local elites alive but subordinated. Those who submitted early could be kept in place as Ardashir's representatives. Those who resisted were defeated and replaced. Each victory did more than expand his territory. It expanded his claim. On his coins, the imagery shifted. Fire altars grew more prominent. Royal busts took on a more stylized, crowned appearance. The legends attached to his name began to stress not just local kingship, but connections to the gods and to an Iranian concept of kingship that reached back before the Arsacids. In later rock reliefs, Ardashir would be shown receiving the royal diadem from a divine figure, a visual language of legitimacy that merged religion with monarchy. The message was consistent. He was not just another ambitious noble, he was favoured, perhaps chosen, to restore a proper order. This symbolic work mattered because he was not operating in a vacuum. There are signs that by this point, frustration with Arsacid rule was not confined to Persis. Repeated civil wars among the Arsacid princes, shifting frontiers with Rome, and the heavy burdens of mustering for distant campaigns had likely strained relations between the imperial centre and its subject regions. Merchants in the south might have resented disrupted trade routes. Priests might have watched uneasily as royal attention and patronage shifted northward, toward Mesopotamia and the western frontier. Local nobles might have felt that their ancient honours were being diluted by new favourites at court. None of this produces open revolt on its own, but it creates a climate in which a successful regional strongman can present himself as the solution. Ardashir seems to have understood that climate. When he defeated neighbouring rulers, he could cast those victories as more than personal triumphs. He could frame them as purifications, restorations of proper worship, restorations of rightful Persian leadership in lands that had drifted under weak or foreign-influenced hands. His use of fire temple imagery, his emphasis on ancient-sounding titles, his careful positioning near the ruins of Persepolis all spoke to a shared sense that something old and valuable had been neglected. In such a context, anti-Arsacid sentiment did not need to be loud to be powerful. It could exist as a quiet comparison. The Arsacid king in Ctesiphon struggled to control his own nobles. Rome still stood on the western horizon, undefeated but unmastered. Meanwhile, in the far south, a ruler was actually conquering, actually stabilizing, actually patronizing ancient cults and sites. For many observers, that contrast alone may have been enough to shift their sympathies, if not yet their declared loyalties. Step by step, Ardashir's status changed. At first, he was a dynast within the Arsacid world, adjusting local balances. Then he was the dominant lord of Persis, still nominally a client of the empire but acting with increasing independence. Then he was a conqueror of neighbouring provinces, whose power and wealth could no longer be dismissed as a southern curiosity. At some point along that curve, he crossed an invisible line. From the perspective of Ctesiphon, he was no longer a useful vassal who kept the south quiet. He was a competitor assembling an alternative centre of gravity. His consolidation of Persis, his victories on the margins, his growing network of loyal nobles and priests, all pointed in a single direction. If he was not checked, he would not just withdraw from the empire, he would set himself up as another empire. The transformation was not sudden, but by the time it became impossible to ignore, it was already advanced. The Arsacid king could no longer treat Ardashir as one among many local notables to be reassured or threatened into line. He had to be confronted as a rising power in his own right. A vassal had turned himself into a rival, and in the next stage of the story that rivalry would move out of the hills and valleys of Persis and onto the open plain where dynasties rise and fall, the battlefield. By the time Ardashir's ambitions could no longer be ignored, the man who sat on the Arsacid throne was Artabanus IV. He did not inherit a peaceful realm. Artabanus emerged from a tangle of rival princes and half-settled civil wars. Earlier Arsacid kings had split territories, elevated brothers and cousins, and relied on great noble houses whose loyalty was always provisional. The result by the early 3rd century was not a single unchallenged monarch, but a king who had to spend as much time fighting other Arsacids as he did ruling the empire. Artabanus seems to have been one of the more forceful of these late kings. In Greek and Roman sources he appears as a man willing to take the field himself, to impose his will by direct action rather than endless compromise. In Armenian traditions he is a player in dynastic struggles across the northern frontier. In later Iranian memory, he becomes the last link in a chain that was already rusting. So when reports reached the Arsacid court that a vassal king in the far south had begun acting like an emperor, they did not fall on a complacent ruler. They reached someone who understood that his authority was contested everywhere, and that losing one region could trigger losses elsewhere. But understanding and capacity are not the same thing. From Ctesiphon, the first impulse was probably to treat Ardashir as a problem that could be managed at a distance. A letter, a summons, perhaps an order to appear at court, promises of recognition if he scaled back his claims, threats of punishment if he did not, the usual tools of imperial politics. Ardashir did not scale back. Instead, the conflict escalated step by step. Our sources are fragmentary and often coloured by later Sasanian propaganda, but certain patterns emerge. There seem to have been early clashes between Arsacid forces and Ardashir's troops in the borderlands north of Persis, perhaps around places like Istaka and in the approaches to Khuzestan. These were not yet decisive. They were probes, tests of strength on both sides. For Artabanus, the stakes were larger than those skirmishes might suggest. If Persis broke away and remained merely independent, that would be damaging enough. The Arsacid king would lose revenue from a wealthy region, lose access to its manpower and its strategic position on the Gulf. But Ardashir was not simply seceding. He was claiming a different vision of Iranian kingship, invoking older traditions than the Arsacid line could easily counter. Letting that stand would send a dangerous signal. To the noble houses in Media and Hyrcania, it would suggest that the king in Ctesiphon could be defied if one had a strong enough base. To the semi-autonomous dynasts in Elymais, Characene, and beyond, it would hint that new patrons were available in the south. To Rome, watching from across the frontier, it would advertise weakness more clearly than any battlefield defeat. Strategically, Persis was a corner of the empire. Politically, it was a hinge. So Artabanus seems to have moved from a policy of distant pressure to one of direct confrontation. He began gathering support among the nobility, calling on vassal kings who still saw their fortunes tied to the Arsacid house. There are hints in the sources of alliances with local rulers in Messene and Elymais, and of recruitment among steppe cavalry who had long formed the hard core of Parthian armies. But the late Arsacid world was not a simple map of loyalists and rebels. Regional loyalties were layered and practical. A noble might answer the king's summons, yet quietly reach out to Ardashir, hedging his bets. A priest might accept Arsacid offerings, while also welcoming Ardashir's patronage of local fire temples. Traders might finance both sides, ensuring that whichever banner prevailed, their caravans could keep moving. Modern historians reading between the lines of coins, inscriptions, and later chronicles see a landscape of shifting alignments rather than firm blocks. In the north and west, where Arsacid power was more immediate, and where fear of Roman intervention remained real, Artabanus could likely still count on significant backing. In the south and southeast, where Ardashir's victories and religious imagery had begun to reshape expectations, loyalties were looser, more negotiable. Preparation for the coming clash played out in this uncertain environment. Ardashir strengthened fortifications in the passes leading into Persis and expanded his armies with recruits from recently subdued regions. Artabanus, for his part, tried to pull together a coalition that could project force deep into the south. Both sides understood that the conflict could not remain a series of border raids forever. At some point one would have to march into the other's heartland. The sources hint at a sequence of campaigns in which Ardashir pushed further north, taking towns that had long acknowledged Arsacid authority. Each acquisition peeled away another layer of the old order. Local elites forced to choose faced a calculation: remain with a distant king whose grip seemed to be slipping, or accept the overlordship of a nearby conqueror who was visibly on the rise. Some joined Artabanus, perhaps out of habit, perhaps out of genuine commitment to the dynasty that had ruled for centuries. Others waited. A few, sensing the way the wind was blowing, quietly supported Ardashir with supplies or information. This mixture of loyalty, caution, and opportunism made any strategy risky. For Artabanus, delay was dangerous. Every campaigning season that passed without a decisive blow gave Ardashir more time to consolidate his gains and refine his royal image. The longer the south looked stable under its new master, the less persuasive Arsacid claims to universal kingship appeared. Eventually the drift toward confrontation hardened into an unavoidable march. Artabanus gathered his forces, drawing in contingents from across the plateau and the western lowlands. Ardashir, confident enough now to meet the great king in the open, prepared his own army, built on the disciplined core that had conquered Persis and its neighbours. Both men seemed to have understood that the next major engagement would not just decide the fate of a province. It would decide the question that had been hanging over Iran for years. Would the Arsacid house find a way to reassert itself one more time, Or would a rebel vassal complete his transformation into a new kind of king? On the road to that answer, their armies moved toward a plain that would become synonymous with the end of one empire and the beginning of another. Hormozdgan was waiting. When later historians wrote about it, they made Hormozdgan sound like a single afternoon that changed everything. One clash of armies, one fallen king, one new dynasty rising from the dust. The reality, as far as we can reconstruct it, was probably more drawn out, more uncertain, and more human. But there does seem to have been a moment, somewhere on a plain in southwestern Iran, around the year 224, when the balance finally tipped. We do not know exactly where Hormozdgan was. The name survives in later sources, but the landscape has changed, and the ancient road network that connected Persis, Messene, and the interior has long since been buried. Some scholars place it near the fringes of Khuzestan, where the lowlands begin to give way to the uplands of Fars. Others imagine a field not far from ancient Susa, or along one of the routes that caravans used to move between the Gulf and the royal capitals. The one point of agreement is that it lay in a zone where both armies could operate, close enough to the south for Ardashir to feel confident, but not so far from the centre that Artabanus would refuse to fight. If you strip away the layers of legend, a plausible picture emerges. Artabanus appears to have brought with him what remained of a truly imperial army. Heavy cavalry nobles with long experience in Parthian warfare, horse archers from the steppe fringes, contingents from loyal vassal kings in Messene and Elymais, perhaps even some armoured cataphracts, the shock troops that had once humiliated Roman legions at Carrhae. Facing him, Ardashir commanded a force that looked, on paper, smaller and more provincial, elite cavalry drawn from Persis and the neighbouring regions he had recently subdued, local infantry hardened by siege work and mountain campaigning, followers from noble houses who had quietly crossed over to his side as his power grew. By this point he was no longer just a rebellious governor, he was presenting himself as King of Kings, the same title the Arsacids claimed, and his army was the instrument of that claim. The sources that describe the battle are late, and often written under Sasanian influence. One later tradition has Ardashir choosing the field carefully, making sure that his troops had access to water, while denying it to the Arsacid host. Another emphasizes tactical ingenuity, Ardashir supposedly deploying his cavalry in depth, drawing the Parthian horse into unfavourable positions before launching a decisive charge. Some accounts place his son Shapur at his side, fighting as a prince who would soon become heir to a new empire. How much of this is literal history and how much is crafted memory is hard to say. What seems consistent is that the battle did not drag on for weeks. This was not a protracted campaign of siege and counter-siege. It was a concentrated encounter in which one side's cohesion broke. In most tellings, that side was Artabanus's. The late Arsacid army carried more than armour and lances into the field. It carried the weight of 2 centuries of imperial habits. Nobles who were as much partners as subjects, vassal kings whose loyalty stopped at the point where their own survival was threatened, commanders who could count as easily as anyone else, who could look at the spread of Ardashir's victories and the tone of his religious messaging and begin to wonder whether they were on the wrong side of history. Once the fighting began, that uncertainty mattered. If even a few key contingents hesitated at the wrong time, held back from committing or abandoned an exposed flank, the carefully balanced structure of the Arsacid battle line could crack. Narratives that survive suggest exactly that. A moment when the king found himself increasingly isolated, his immediate guard still fighting, while other elements of his army gave way. In later Iranian memory, Artabanus dies on that plain. He falls in personal combat with Ardashir, or is cut down in the press of battle, or is slain while fleeing the field. Different versions preserve different details, but all agree that this is where his story ends. Modern historians allow for the possibility that he may have survived the day, only to be killed in the aftermath, or to die of wounds later. But in political terms, it does not make much difference. Hormozdgan is the moment when he ceases to be the king of kings. For Ardashir, that mattered for reasons that went far beyond killing a rival. In the Arsacid world, legitimacy was both personal and collective. The dynasty's right to rule was wrapped up in its control of the royal family network, its long-standing supremacy over the noble houses, and its success in defending the empire's frontiers. Defeating an Arsacid king in the open field did more than remove a particular individual. It sent a clear message to everyone who depended on that system. The message was simple. The old structure could no longer protect them. News of Hormozdgan would have travelled quickly along the same roads that had brought the armies there. Couriers from surviving nobles carrying their own versions of what had happened. Refugees trailing after broken units. Merchants and priests hearing sudden changes in which name was invoked first in prayers and contracts. In that flow of information, perception unravelled even faster than territory. A noble house in Media that might have held out against Ardashir when Artabanus still commanded a field army now faced a different calculation. There was no longer an obvious champion to rally around, no immediate prospect of a counterstroke from the centre. Local rulers in Messene or Elymais, watching the dust settle, could see that whatever happened next, the Arsacid line was no longer the unchallenged apex of Iranian politics. Some of them resisted, others negotiated, many adapted. Within a short span of years, coins bearing Arsacid names disappear from key regions. In their place appear issues struck in Ardashir's name, sometimes still cautiously local, sometimes boldly proclaiming universal titles. In inscriptions, he begins to speak not only of his victories over Artabanus, but of a restored Iranian kingship rooted in an older, almost mythic past. He is not just the man who won Hormozdgan. He is the heir to a pre-Parthian idea of empire. This is why Hormozdgan is more than a dynastic bookmark. The battle came at the end of a long erosion of Arsacid authority, yet it also functioned as a hinge. It provided a single, memorable event that contemporaries and later generations could point to as the turning point. Before Hormozdgan, there was still a contest between competing visions of rule, waged across provinces and decades. After Hormozdgan, that contest narrowed rapidly. One claimant stood victorious, and the other had no effective successor. In the calm of hindsight, it can look almost inevitable. An empire that had been straining under internal division, trying to manage powerful nobles and distant vassals, finally met a challenger who combined local strength, ideological appeal, and military effectiveness. On a plane whose exact location we no longer know, those trends converged into a single outcome. The Arsacid order didn't vanish overnight. Its customs, its noble families, its memories lingered in the new Sasanian state. But as a living, functioning system of power, it broke at Hormozdgan. Ardashir's victory gave him what no series of provincial conquests could fully grant: the right, in the eyes of friend and former foe alike, to claim that the age of Parthia had ended and that a new imperial order had begun. When Roman writers thought about the East, they tended to imagine one kind of story. An army marches out led by a famous general, it crosses rivers and deserts, it besieges cities, it fights pitched battles with an enemy that retreats, then returns, then seems to vanish into the horizon. Sometimes Rome wins a province, sometimes it loses a legion, but the basic pattern stays the same. Pressure from outside applied again and again against a resilient opponent. Ardashir's story belongs to a different category. He did not arrive at the head of a foreign army. He did not have to cross the Zagros passes as an outsider, or guess which noble houses could be trusted, or try to force his will on a landscape whose politics he barely understood. He grew up inside the system he eventually destroyed, and that difference, more than any single battle, explains why he succeeded where Rome never could. For centuries, Rome had been dealing with Parthia from the wrong angle. From the west, the Arsacid Empire looked like a single block, a king of kings in the centre, vassal kingdoms around him, a frontier that could be pushed a little east or west depending on who had the stronger army that decade. To a Roman planner in Antioch or Rome, it made sense to imagine that if you could defeat the king and take a capital, the whole structure would topple. But inside Iran, the real lines of strength and weakness ran differently. Power was layered and local. Noble houses in Media and Hyrcania with their own followings, their own grudges, their own marriage alliances. Urban elites in Mesopotamian cities whose fortunes depended on trade routes more than on loyalty to any particular dynasty. Priesthoods and landholders in Persis, Elymes, and Characene whose religious and economic worlds reached backward into older, pre-Parthian traditions. Roman generals saw a rival empire. Ardashir saw fault lines. He knew which nobles had feuded with which branches of the Arsacid family. He understood how far a satrap could push local tax demands before villages would quietly back an alternative. He understood, perhaps more than any Roman ever could, the emotional weight of certain ideas, the memory of earlier Iranian kingship, the prestige of certain fire temples, the resentment that could build when central authority felt distant and yet intrusive. His status as a vassal king was not just a starting point, it was an education. As ruler of Persis, he issued coins, negotiated with neighbouring powers, and watched the flow of goods through Gulf ports. He attended, or at least sent envoys to, royal gatherings. He heard the language of Arsacid legitimacy from the inside. He could see where it still carried conviction and where it had become formula. Vassal status also gave him room to move without immediately triggering a full imperial response. When a Roman army crossed the Euphrates, everyone noticed. Envoys flew, musters were called, governors reported up the chain. A frontier invasion was an alarm bell that rang across the political system. But when a local king in Persis fortified a few more hilltops, or adjusted his titulature, or quietly drew neighbouring districts into his orbit, it could be dismissed as internal friction, something to be managed later. By the time Artabanus truly recognised Ardashir as an existential threat, much of the groundwork had already been laid. Local loyalties had been courted. Religious narratives had been sharpened. Alternative futures had been whispered in the halls of noble houses that were accustomed to thinking in terms of shifting loyalties anyway. This is also where Ardashir's ideological project mattered. Rome could defeat an Arsacid king in battle and, at best, install another member of the same dynasty or a local ally as a client. The framework remained. The king of kings stayed an Arsacid. The great houses remained what they had been. The rituals and stories that justified the order were bruised but intact. Ardashir aimed for something deeper than a personnel change. In his inscriptions and later Sasanian tradition, he presents himself not just as a successful warlord, but as the restorer of a more ancient Iranian kingship. He links his rule to the memory of the Achaemenids and to a renewed partnership with a recentered Zoroastrian religious establishment. He does not merely replace Artabanus. He claims to renew the very idea of empire in the Iranian world. That ideological renewal went hand in hand with centralization. Under the early Sasanians, royal authority becomes more direct. Old vassal kingdoms are reduced or abolished, their rulers transformed into nobles under a far more intrusive crown. Royal fire temples are endowed and placed under tighter control. Administrative offices are standardized. The loose, negotiated autonomy that had allowed Parthia to flex and survive Roman pressure becomes much more constrained. The military follows the same pattern. Where the Arsacid state had relied heavily on the personal contingents of great houses and semi-independent kings, Ardashir and his successors begin to assemble a more organised, hierarchically commanded force. Elite cavalry still matter, but they are increasingly tied to royal service. Fortified frontiers, garrison towns, and more systematic mustering of infantry suggest a state trying to move from ad hoc coalitions to something closer to a standing army. A Roman general could strike hard, devastate a region, even seize Ctesiphon. But when the legions withdrew, the old pattern of power could reassert itself. Local kings would recalculate, make new deals, resume their roles within the Arsacid framework. Ardashir did not march in from the outside and then leave. He stayed, and he rewrote the rules. So did Parthia fall because of one man or because of long-term structural weakness? The evidence points to both, interacting over time. By the early 3rd century, the Arsacid order had accumulated stresses, rival claimants to the throne, powerful nobles whose interests increasingly diverged from the centre, vassal kings who could see that the empire's aura of inevitability was dimming. Roman pressure had exposed these weaknesses, but could not by itself resolve them. The empire could contract, adjust, and continue. What Ardashir did was to appear at precisely the moment when those weaknesses made a decisive internal challenger possible, and to possess the combination of local embeddedness, ideological clarity, and military effectiveness needed to turn possibility into reality. Another ambitious vassal might have risen earlier, only to be crushed by a still cohesive Arsacid centre. Another crisis might have passed with yet one more compromise between king and nobles. For centuries that had been the pattern. Ardashir broke the pattern. He did it not by being more powerful than Rome in any absolute sense, but by understanding from within how the Parthian world actually worked, and by offering enough people within that world a new structure that seemed, at that moment, more promising than the old. Rome could batter the walls from the outside. Ardashir walked through the corridors, found the load-bearing pillars, and then built something new on the ruins. When Ardashir defeated Artabanus on the plain of Hormozdgan, he did not just end one reign and begin another. He changed the grammar of power in the Iranian world. In later tradition, the moment is presented almost as a restoration. The old line has failed. A worthier house, rooted in holy places and ancient memory, steps forward to carry the burden of kingship. Ardashir is not simply King of Kings. On his inscriptions he is Mazda-worshipping Lord of the race of the gods, son of Papag, who is himself linked to Sasan, a semi-legendary figure tied to priesthood and sacred fire. It is a deliberately different claim from that of the Arsacids. The Arsacids had grown from steppe warlords into monarchs. Their legitimacy was built on long successful rule, noble bargains, and the language of Iranian kingship adapted to a world of powerful vassals. Ardashir, by contrast, leans hard into the idea that kingship is a religious office as much as a political one, that it flows from a partnership between the royal house and the god Ahura Mazda. In stone carvings, he is shown receiving a diadem directly from the deity. Crown and glory are no longer just the outcome of victory and negotiation. They are presented as something closer to a sacred trust. That does not mean everything changed overnight. In many ways, the Sasanian Empire that emerges from the 220s looks, at first glance, like Parthia under a new management. There is still a king of kings. There are still powerful noble families with landed bases and cavalry forces. Many local elites who had served Arsacid kings continued into Sasanian service. Cities like Ctesiphon remained royal centres. The Roman frontier still ran along familiar rivers and passes. Even the tools of rule showed continuity. Coinage, for example, had already been a key medium of royal messaging under the Arsacids. The Sasanians keep this, but sharpen it. Portraits become more formalized, crowns more elaborate, religious symbols more insistent. What had been a badge of kingship becomes an almost programmatic statement. This is a divinely favoured, uniquely legitimate house. What really begins to shift is the balance inside the system. The Arsacid world had been a web. Kings, great houses, vassal dynasties, priestly establishments, urban elites, all negotiating and renegotiating their positions. That web did not vanish under the Sasanians, but its threads were pulled much tighter toward the centre. Vassal kings lose ground. Some are simply absorbed. Their hereditary thrones become provinces, their crowns translated into noble rank at court. Offices that once had a strong local flavour are increasingly standardised. Titles repeat across regions. Law codes, though imperfectly preserved, hint at attempts to impose more uniform norms over a wide and varied landscape. The religious sphere undergoes something similar. Under the Arsacids, Iranian religious practice had been diverse, with Zoroastrian traditions sitting alongside local cults, Greek deities, Mesopotamian gods, and more. The Sasanians, especially from the later 3rd century onward, pushed toward a more organized Zoroastrian establishment. Fire temples are endowed, priesthoods are systematized, canonical texts are gathered and shaped. Other beliefs continue, but the official image of the empire becomes much more narrowly defined. King, god, and right order woven together. From Rome's perspective, this means the eastern neighbour it now faces is not simply a new dynasty on an old throne. It is a state that aspires to be more coherent. Diplomatically, this shows up quickly. Envoys from the new King of Kings of Iran speak in terms of equality with Rome, sometimes even superiority. Roman emperors now correspond not with an occasionally distracted Arsacid, who must satisfy fractious nobles, but with rulers who present themselves as universal monarchs of a sacral empire. Militarily, the change is gradual but real. Sasanian armies still rely on elite cavalry, armoured horsemen who are in many ways heirs of Parthian cataphracts. But over time, Rome encounters more structured frontier defences, lines of fortresses, garrisoned cities, and forces that look less like a collection of allied contingents and more like components of a royal army. Siegecraft improves. Coordination across fronts becomes more ambitious. The loose resilience that had allowed Parthia to absorb defeat and reconstitute itself gives way to a more brittle, but also more formidable machine. If the legions smash one Sasanian army, they may face years of breathing space before another major campaign, just as before. But when Sasanians gain the upper hand, they are increasingly capable not just of raiding, but of organised occupations, deportations, and diplomatic pressure that ties back into a strong royal court. And yet, beneath all this, Parthia does not disappear. Its legacy persists in the deep structures of Iranian statecraft. The very title, King of Kings, is a Parthian instrument, refined by a new house. The habit of ruling through great magnates, even when constrained, remains. Cavalry culture, aristocratic estates, the use of client rulers or outer fringes, all these are Parthian tools carried forward. Even the Roman-Iranian diplomatic dance with its alternation of war, treaty, hostage exchange and prestige bargaining is something the Sasanians inherit rather than invent. They step into a long-established rhythm and then add new choreography. Seen this way, 224 is not just the fall of one empire and the rise of another, it is a hinge moment in the wider history of Eurasia. On one side lies a looser, more federated world, where steppe traditions, Hellenistic legacies and local autonomies combine to produce an empire that can endure pressure by flexing. On the other side stands a more centralized, ideologically sharpened state, one that will match Rome not just in battle, but in claims about order, truth, and rightful rule. For the next 4 centuries, Roman emperors and Sasanian shahs will confront each other as near equals. Their conflicts will shape trade routes, religious developments, and the political geography of everything from the Caucasus to the Persian Gulf. The shadow of that contest will still be visible when new powers, Arab Muslim armies from the south, steppe confederations from the north, move into the vacuum left by their decline. Parthia's achievement was to hold a vast, diverse space together for nearly 400 years in the face of one of history's most aggressive military machines. Ardashir's achievement was to take the tools Parthia had forged, discard what no longer worked, and create a form of kingship and empire that could stand toe-to-toe with Rome on new terms. That is why the battle on that dusty field in 224 matters. It closed the long chapter of Arsacid rule, but it also opened another. A sharper, more ideologically charged age in which the old Mediterranean superpower would no longer be staring at a flexible frontier rival, but at a mirror of its own imperial ambitions, polished in a different tradition and anchored in the deep memory of the Iranian plateau. For almost 4 centuries, Parthia had been the river forced through the narrow channel. Roman invasions, civil wars, steppe incursions, local revolts, each of these could have torn it apart. But the Arsacid system absorbed pressure by bending instead of breaking. Geography helped. Those long stretches of steppe and mountain and desert acted like shock absorbers. Roman armies could drive deep in a single campaign, seize cities, even sack a capital, but they could not easily hold the open spaces beyond the rivers. Once the legions withdrew, the old patterns reasserted themselves. Local nobles rallied their horsemen. Vassal kings weighed the winds and chose new loyalties. A new Arsacid claimant rode out from somewhere in the Iranian world, raised on the same cavalry traditions and aristocratic networks as the last. Cavalry power helped too. Parthian warfare was built around mobility, horse archers who could harass an enemy for days, cataphracts who could deliver a concentrated shock at exactly the right moment. That combination made Rome cautious. A decisive victory seemed always out of reach, a decisive defeat always a possibility. But the real secret lay in the way Parthia was put together. It was not a single block of power. It was a lattice of elite alliances, noble houses, and semi-independent thrones bound together by habit, prestige, and mutual need. Kings of kings rose and fell, but the web endured. When one strand snapped under Roman pressure, others held. When a campaign toppled a monarch, the same noble families simply shifted their support to another claimant from the Arsacid line. From a Roman point of view, this could be maddening. They could burn cities, capture princes, even parade Parthian royalty through triumphs in Rome, yet the empire behind them refused to vanish. It healed, it reassembled. It came back with another king, another bargain, another composite army of mounted nobles and local levies. The irony is that what Rome could not accomplish from outside eventually happened from within. Ardashir was not some distant barbarian invader. He was a product of that very lattice, a regional ruler in Persis, a man whose power rested on cavalry, vassalage, and sacred ties, exactly the ingredients that had sustained Parthia. He did not break the system by rejecting it. He mastered it more completely than his Arsacid overlord, and then used it to claim a sharper, more centralized kingship. Parthia, in that sense, fell to its own frontier. The very zone that had once been a loyal border kingdom became the launching pad for a challenger who spoke the language of Iranian kingship more intensely, wrapped it in stronger religious claims, and persuaded enough of the old elite that his order would be safer, more glorious, more pleasing to God. This is one of the quiet lessons of its story. Empires are rarely erased by foreign swords alone. They erode, reconfigure, and finally transform from the inside. External pressure exposes weaknesses. Internal actors decide what to do with them. Sometimes, as with Parthia, the result is not a void, but a new empire that looks familiar, and yet insists it is something entirely different. The Roman-Parthian frontier did not disappear in 224. It changed hands. What had been the loose, bargaining world of the Arsacids became the more tightly drawn realm of the Sasanians. Cavalry still thundered across the plains. Kings still called themselves kings of kings. But the balance of power inside the Iranian world had shifted, and with it the character of Rome's eastern horizon. If you've listened this far, and you're drifting towards sleep with Parthian horsemen and Sasanian crowns, somewhere in the background, you've just walked through 400 years of quiet resilience and sudden transformation. If you'd like more journeys like this, you can gently tap like, subscribe, and when you have a moment, leave a comment. I'd love to know where you're listening from. What city, what country, what corner of the world is sharing this nighttime history? And if the deeper currents of the past fascinate you, the long bottlenecks, the hidden ancestors, the prehistoric turns that shaped everything later, you might be interested in the book about prehistoric secrets I've put together. You can find it, along with more sleepy history, at sleepytimehistory.com.